The air inside the command deck of the Ethelgard tasted of recycled oxygen and the sharp ozone tang of cooling conduits. Commander Vaelen Thorne stood before the expansive, crystalline viewport, her reflection a ghost against the backdrop of the swirling nebula known as the Onyx Rift. She was a towering figure of slate-gray skin, etched with bioluminescent violet veins that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic thrum, a visual heartbeat that betrayed her current agitation. Her markings were glowing brighter than usual, a sign of suppressed fury that her subordinates knew well enough to avoid. "ETA on the Terran transport, Lieutenant." Valen's voice was a low rasp, like grinding stones. 3 minutes, Commander," Lieutenant Crix replied, his 4 eyes focused intently on his console. He was a veteran of the Siege of Kiros, his own markings scarred and dull. "The diplomatic envoy has cleared the final security perimeter. They are requesting docking bay 4. Valen's jaw tightened, revealing the slight protrusion of her upper canines. "A diplomatic partner. A human. Tell me, Crix, did we spill 3 decades of blood just to end up sharing our mess halls with primates who can barely breathe our atmosphere without technological crutches?" "The High Command sees it as a necessity, ma'am," Crix said, his tone carefully neutral. "The Convergence Treaty is the only thing keeping the Synaptic Union from resuming their border raids. The humans have the warp gate coordinates we need. We have the refined graviton cells they crave. This Architect Pair Initiative is the ceremonial seal." "It's a leash," Vaelen spat. "They want to put a human shadow on every Centauri commander to ensure we don't start the war again. They think we're rabid hounds that need a soft-skinned handler." She turned away from the stars, her heavy boots thudding against the metallic deck. The Ethelgard was the pride of the Centauri fleet, a fortress capable of cracking a planet's crust, and yet today it felt small, invaded by the looming presence of a single human. The docking sequence engaged with a distant groan of hydraulic clamps. Vaelen didn't go down to meet him. She waited in her private briefing room, a chamber designed to intimidate. It was sparse, lit by the dim violet glow of the wall-mounted energy cells, with 2 chairs carved from obsidian heavy silicate. When the door finally hissed open, Vaelen did not stand. She remained seated, her hands resting on the table like twin slabs of granite. The man who walked in was not the bloated bureaucrat or the trembling clerk she had imagined. Elias Vance was lean, wearing a charcoal-colored suit that looked more functional than ceremonial. His skin was pale, a stark contrast to the Centauri gray, and his hair was the color of parched earth, cropped short. He walked with a steady, measured gait, his footsteps nearly silent. "Commander Thorne," he said. His voice was calm, devoid of the frantic pitch she often heard from humans in the presence of a superior predator. "You're late, envoy," she lied. He was exactly on time. "Docking procedures on a dreadnought of this scale are quite rigorous, ma'am. I apologize for the delay." He stood before her, not bowing, but offering a slight tilt of his head. His eyes caught the violet light. They were amber, clear, and disturbingly perceptive. "I am Elias Vance. I believe our papers are already synchronized in your terminal." Vaelen rose then, using her full height of 7 feet to tower over him. She stepped into his personal space, her shadow swallowing him whole. Most humans fidgeted. They looked at the floor. They smelled of sweat and cortisol. Elias simply stood there, his scent neutralized by some medical spray, his pulse steady in the hollow of his throat. "You volunteered for this," Vaelen said, her voice dropping an octave. "Why? Did you run out of boring offices to sit in on Earth? Or do you have a death wish that involves being crushed by the atmospheric pressure of our culture?" Elias maintained eye contact. "The top brass thinks this is a PR stunt, Commander." "I don't. I think the war ended because we both realized that the void is too big to face alone. I volunteered because I'd rather spend my life building a bridge than waiting for someone else to blow it up." Vaelen barked a short, harsh laugh. "Noble, but bridges are built with steel, not words. You think you're my partner? My counterpart? You are an anchor, envoy, a weight I have to drag through the stars." "Then let me prove I can carry my own weight," Elias replied. "Oh, you will." Vaelen leaned in until her glowing markings cast a violet sheen over his face. "Starting tomorrow, you will be subjected to the trials of the 9 gates, the same regimen my elite grunts endure. If you survive, perhaps I'll let you sit at my table. If you fail, which you will request a transfer, and I will be rid of this political charade. Do we have a deal, or are you ready to bug out already? Elias didn't blink. I accept, but if I pass, you agree to one exchange for every trial. You will learn one facet of human strategy or culture. No dismissals, no arrogance. You engage with it genuinely. Vaelen's eyes narrowed. The audacity was refreshing in a maddening way. Agreed. Get your gear to the guest quarters. Don't get comfortable. You won't be staying long enough to unpack. As Elias turned to leave, he paused at the door. One thing, Commander. I've seen your combat logs from the Rift. You're a brilliant tactician, but even the sharpest blade notches if it only ever hits stone. Maybe it's time you tried a different edge. The door hissed shut before she could respond. Vaelen looked at her hands. They were trembling, not with fear, but with a strange, electric anticipation. This human was a glutton for punishment. She would enjoy breaking him. The training deck was a cavernous space of cold light and humming machinery. It was 0500 hours, the time the Centauri called the Ghost Watch, when the ship's systems were at their quietest and the soul was supposed to be at its most vulnerable. Elias Vance stood in the center of the Grav Plateau, wearing a thin black compression suit. His body felt stiff, the old ache in his joints a constant reminder of the radiation he'd inhaled during the evacuation of the Solstice colony years ago. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the night studying Centauri biological responses. He knew what Vaelen Thorne was trying to do. She wasn't just testing his body, she was testing his spirit. "Envoy, you're early," Vaelen's voice echoed from the observation gallery above. She leapt down, landing with a heavy thud that didn't even bend her knees. She was dressed in a dark, sleeveless combat vest, her muscled arms a map of scars and glowing veins. "The early bird gets the worm, Commander," Elias said, adjusting his gloves. Vaelen tilted her head. "A strange idiom. On Cetar, the early predator is the one who hasn't eaten in a week. They are the most desperate. Is that what you are, Elias?" "Desperate? Persistent is the word I prefer." Vaelen walked to the control panel on the wall. "Gate 1. The burden of sovereignty. We regulate the gravity plates to match the surface of Vaelonis Prime, 3 times the Terran standard. Most of your kind would have their internal organs turned to mush within 20 minutes. Your task is simple. Walk 30 laps. If you fall, the trial is over." "Understood." Vaelen punched a command into the terminal. Elias felt it immediately. It wasn't just a weight. It was a physical hand pressing down on his skull, his shoulders, his very lungs. His knees buckled, the metal floor suddenly becoming a magnet for his bones. The air felt like liquid lead. "Go," Vaelen commanded. Elias took his first step. It was agonizing. Every muscle fiber screamed in protest. He could hear the audible groan of his own spine. He focused on his breathing, slow, shallow, controlled. He didn't look at Vaelen. He looked at the floor, 1 meter ahead. 10 laps in, his vision began to blur. The violet light of the training deck seemed to bleed into the shadows. He could feel the sweat pooling in his boots, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You look like you're about to keel over, Envoy." Vaelen's voice drifted through the haze. She was walking beside him, moving with an effortless grace that was a deliberate insult. "Just say the word. Request the transfer. There's a warm bed and a soft chair waiting for you on the transport." "Not today," Elias wheezed. His voice was a thread, but it didn't snap. 20 laps. His legs were shaking so violently he was certain his femurs would crack. The pain from his condition, the cellular decay, began to flare, a white-hot fire licking at his nerves. It was a familiar ghost, but under 3 gravities, it was a demon. He bit his lip until he tasted blood. "Don't show it. Don't let her see the weakness." Vaelen stopped walking and watched him. Her expression was unreadable, but her markings were pulsing in a frantic, jagged pattern. She was seeing something she didn't expect. She expected him to beg, or to collapse into a heap of sobbing meat. Instead, she was watching a man turn himself into a pillar of sheer, stubborn will. When Elias completed the 30th lap, he didn't stop immediately. He took 3 more steps before Vaelen deactivated the gravity field. The sudden release of pressure was almost as painful as the weight itself. Elias fell to his knees, gasping for air that finally felt thin and sweet. He stayed there for a long minute, his forehead resting against the cool metal of the deck. A large gray hand appeared in his field of vision. Vaelen was offering him a hand up. Elias looked at it, then slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up using his own strength. He didn't take her hand. He stood on his own 2 feet, swaying slightly, but upright. "One lap, for every year of the war," Elias panted, wiping the sweat from his eyes. "I believe I pass." Vaelen withdrew her hand, her eyes flashing. "You survived. Don't mistake survival for mastery. You've barely scratched the surface of what it means to be Sitari. And you," Elias managed a weak smile, "have an obligation to fulfill." "Our deal, Commander." Vaelen crossed her arms, her bioluminescence dimming to a steady low hum. "Speak then, human. What is this cultural exchange I must endure?" Elias leaned against a support pillar, his body still trembling. "Sit with me, in the mess hall, not as a commander, but as a person, and you will listen to a piece of music I brought. No talking, just listening." "Music? You want me to waste time on sounds?" "Genuine engagement, Vaelen." Those were the terms. An hour later, they sat in a secluded corner of the Dreadnought's mess hall. The Sitari soldiers nearby kept a respectful distance, their 4 eyes darting between their fearsome commander and the pale human who looked like he'd been dragged through an asteroid belt. Elias placed a small circular device on the table. He pressed a button, and a soft, haunting melody began to play. It was a cello solo, deep, mournful, yet possessing a soaring resilience. It was the sound of a species that had known great loss and still found the breath to sing. Vaelen sat perfectly still. At first, her expression was one of bored tolerance, but as the music progressed, the tension in her shoulders began to leak away. The bioluminescent veins on her neck flickered in time with the low notes. For the first time, she wasn't scanning for threats or calculating firing solutions. She was simply being. When the music faded into silence, Vaelen didn't speak for a long time. "It sounds like the wind in the canyons of Thorne Val," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I haven't heard that sound in 20 years. "We call it a dirge," Elias said. "We play it when we lose something we can't replace, but we also play it when we realize that what we lost still lives in the memory of the sound." Vaelen looked at him, her gaze sharp and searching. "Why did you really volunteer, Elias? A man who can endure that gravity well isn't a diplomat. You're a soldier. Why the charade?" "Because the war didn't just kill people, Vaelen," Elias replied, his voice steady. "It killed our ability to see each other. I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to make sure we don't have to fight anyone else. Your people think we're weak. My people think you're monsters. We're both wrong." Vaelen stood up, the wall of her military persona slamming back into place. "Tomorrow, 0400, combat training. No armor, no weapons, just skin and bone. We'll see if your bridge building survives a Sitari strike." She turned and marched away, but Elias noticed a small detail. She hadn't called him envoy this time. She'd used his name. He leaned back, closing his eyes as the pain in his joints finally began to recede. It was a small victory, a tiny notch in a very thick wall. But as he looked at the obsidian chair where she had sat, he saw a single faint smudge of gray, a sign that for a moment the commander had forgotten to be made of stone. "1 gate down," Elias whispered. 8 to go." The combat bay of the Ethel Guard was a stark, circular arena lined with vibration-dampening floor mats that smelled faintly of sterile foam and old sweat. At 0400 hours, the station's simulated night cycle was at its dimmest, but the arena was flooded with a harsh, surgical white light. A crowd had gathered in the upper tiers, Sitari soldiers, their violet markings flickering with anticipation. They had heard of the human who survived the gravity well, and they had come to see the shatter glass finally break. In Sitari slang, a shatter glass was someone who looked pretty until the first real blow landed. Vaelen Thorne stood in the center, her slate-gray skin glistening. She had stripped down to a simple chest wrap and combat trousers, exposing the dense corded muscle of her torso. Her markings were a steady, menacing indigo. She didn't use a weapon. Her hands, tipped with blunt but formidable claws, were weapons enough. The second gate, the right of the unyielding flesh, Vaelen announced, her voice carrying easily through the silent bay. In our culture, a commander must be the shield for their brood. If they cannot stand against the storm, they have no right to lead. Today, Elias, there are no grav plates to hide behind, just gravity and bone. Elias Vance entered the circle. He looked smaller than yesterday, his frame lean and almost fragile compared to Vaelen's predatory bulk. He had discarded his suit for a simple gray tank top and shorts. His skin was pale, and as he moved, Vaelen noticed a slight tremor in his right hand. "You're shaking, Elias," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Cold? Or finally realizing that the void is about to swallow you whole?" Elias looked at his hand, then clenched it into a fist. "Just the morning chill, Vaelen, and maybe a little bit of rust. It's been a minute since I had a proper scrap." "A scrap?" Vaelen scoffed. "Is that what you call it? This isn't some back alley brawl in a Terran slum. This is the foundation of our soul. I will not hold back. If I snap your ribs, the medics will patch you up, but I won't stop the clock." "I wouldn't want you to," Elias replied. He shifted his weight, his stance low and fluid. It was a defensive posture, one that reminded Vaelen of a coiled spring. "Don't get snatched, human," a soldier yelled from the rafters. "The commander likes her meat tender." Vaelen didn't wait for a signal. She moved with a speed that defied her size, a blur of gray and violet light. She launched a straight palm strike aimed at Elias's sternum, a move meant to end the fight in 20 seconds. Elias didn't block. He pivoted on his lead foot, his body rotating like a gate on a hinge. Vaelen's hand hissed past his chest, catching only air. She recovered instantly, spinning for a roundhouse kick that could have shattered a support pillar. Elias dropped low, sliding under the arc of her leg, and came up behind her. He didn't strike. He just stood there waiting. "Is this your human strategy?" Vaelen hissed, spinning to face him. "Ghosting? Running? You act like a shadow, Elias." "Shadows don't win wars." "Shadows don't get hit either," Elias said. His breathing was already coming in sharp, ragged bursts. "And I'm not running. I'm just waiting for you to get tired of being a hammer." Vaelen's markings flared a violent, angry purple. She attacked again, a flurry of strikes, hooks, jabs, and low sweeps. Elias was a master of redirection. He used her own momentum against her, his hands guiding her strikes away with a gentle, terrifying precision. Every time she thought she had him hard locked, he slipped through her grip like water. It was a dance, a brutal, lopsided dance where the giant swung and the ghost vanished. "Fight me!" Vaelen roared, her frustration peaking. She lunged, committing her full weight to a tackle. This time Elias didn't vanish. He stepped into her guard, his shoulder connecting with her solar plexus. It wasn't a strike of strength, but of timing. Vaelen's breath left her in a sudden whoosh. Elias grabbed her lead arm, tucked it under his own, and used a hip throw. The crowd gasped. For a fraction of a second, the commander was airborne. She hit the mat with a thud that vibrated through the entire bay. Elias backed away, doubled over, clutching his side. His face was ghostly pale, and he was gasping for air as if he were back in the triple gravity well. Vaelen was on her feet in a heartbeat. Her eyes were wide, her indigo markings pulsating wildly. She was humiliated, but more than that, she was fascinated. "Aikido," she muttered, a term she'd found in the Terran archives. "The art of using an enemy's power. You dare use my own strength as a weapon against me?" "It's the only strength I have right now, Vaelen," Elias wheezed. He straightened up, though it clearly cost him. "You're viper fast and stronger than 10 of me. If I try to be a hammer, I just break my own handle." Vaelen stepped closer, her anger cooling into something sharper. She noticed a dark stain on his gray tank top near his lower ribs. It wasn't sweat. It was a bruise, purple and angry, blooming through the fabric. He'd taken a glancing blow from her earlier, and his human flesh was already weeping. "You're injured," she said, her voice dropping the theatrical commander's tone. "I'm fine. 30 more minutes, right? You're bleeding internally, Elias. Your heart rate is at 190 beats per minute. If we continue, your vines will snap." "The gate is still open," Elias said. his amber eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying lucidity. "I haven't yielded, and I've got 15 minutes of scrap left in me." Vaelen looked up at the tiers of watching soldiers. They were silent now, no longer mocking. They were seeing a human who refused to acknowledge the physical reality of his own fragility. In Sitari culture, that was more than bravery. It was a form of spiritual madness they deeply respected. "The trial is concluded," Vaelen said, her voice loud and clear. "The envoy stands." The soldiers drifted away, whispering in their clicking tongue. Vaelen walked over to Elias, who had finally collapsed onto a bench, his head between his knees. "You're a fool," she said, sitting beside him. "You could have died. For what? A point of honor?" "For the exchange," Elias said, his voice muffled. "I believe I earned it." Vaelen sighed, the bioluminescence on her arms fading to a soft lavender. "Fine. What is the human concept I must learn today? More funeral music? Another lecture on the beauty of weakness?" Elias looked up, a small, crooked smile on his bloodied lip. "No. Today we talk about the Old Sarge syndrome." "Explain." "In our history, there was a type of soldier who stayed in the field long after they should have retired. Not because they loved war, but because they were the only ones who remembered the names of the people who didn't make it. They carried the ghosts so the new kids didn't have to. It made them hard, mean even, but it was an act of love." He paused, looking directly into her indigo eyes. "I think you're an old Sarge, Vaelen. I think you're so busy being a shield that you've forgotten that shields are allowed to have dents." Vaelen froze. The air in the bay felt suddenly cold. "You know nothing of my history, human. I know that your previous squad, the Thorne Guard, was wiped out in the Onyx Rift 20 years ago. You were the only survivor, and since then, you haven't let anyone get close enough to see your markings bleed." Vaelen stood abruptly, her jaw locked. "The exchange is over. Get to the med bay." "That isn't a suggestion, it's a command. If you die on my ship, the treaty becomes FUBAR, and I won't have your ghost cluttering up my corridors." She turned and marched out, her footsteps echoing like gunfire. Elias watched her go, his hand pressed against the blooming bruise on his ribs. "She's notched," he whispered to the empty arena, "and the notch is deep." The tactical simulation suite was a cathedral of glass and light, located in the highest spire of the Ethelgard. In the center was the Iron Map, a three-dimensional holographic projector that could render entire star systems with terrifying fidelity. This was Vaelen Thorne's true domain. Here she wasn't just a warrior, she was a god of geometry and death. Elias walked into the suite at exactly 9 in the morning. He looked battered. A medical patch was visible beneath his shirt, and his movements were stiff, but his amber eyes were as sharp as ever. Vaelen was standing over the Iron Map, her fingers weaving through the holographic light like a harpist. She was wearing her full command regalia, heavy plated armor that shimmered with a dull metallic luster. "The third gate, the Weaver's choice," Vaelen said without looking up. "Physical strength is a tool, but mind is the master. Today we play a game of outcomes. This is the siege of Heliox Outpost, a historical engagement from the second decade of the war." The map flared to life, showing a cluster of icy moons orbiting a gas giant. Tiny points of light, Sitari and human ships, were locked in a brutal orbital dance. "The situation is as follows," Vaelen continued, her voice clinical. "The Sitari fleet is trapped. A Terran blockade has cut off all warp gates. There are 10,000 civilian refugees on the surface of Heliox 4. You have 3 cruisers and a handful of fighters. The Terrans are closing in. If you stay to evacuate the civilians, your fleet is destroyed. If you flee, the civilians are executed as insurgents. Most Sitari cadets choose to sacrifice the fleet for honor or the civilians for survival. Neither is a win. What do you do, envoy?" Elias stepped up to the map, his fingers hovering over the glowing human icons. "This wasn't just a simulation, was it? You were there." "Third Fleet, Task Force Alpha." Valen's markings pulsed once, a sharp flick of violet. "I was a junior lieutenant. We chose the fleet. We fled. The massacre on Heliox 4 lasted 3 days. It is the shame that every Sitari officer carries." "Why give me a scenario that has no solution?" Because understanding the impossible is the only way to avoid it, she snapped. Now play. Show me your human, different edge. Elias didn't move for several minutes. He studied the topography of the ice moons, the gravitational pull of the gas giant, and the positioning of the Terran blockade. He began to input commands, his fingers moving with a slow, deliberate cadence. He didn't move his cruisers to engage the blockade. He didn't send the fighters to the surface for evacuation. Instead, he moved all his ships into the upper atmosphere of the gas giant itself. "You're hiding in the gas?" Vaelen asked, her tone skeptical. "The pressure will crush your hulls in 50 minutes. You're just delaying the inevitable." "Wait for it," Elias said. He then targeted the icy crust of Heliox 3, the moon adjacent to the civilian outpost. He didn't fire at the ships. He fired a concentrated graviton beam at the moon's southern pole. You're fracturing the moon?" Valen's eyes widened. "That's a war crime under the Convergence Treaty. The debris will destroy the outpost." "No." Elias pointed to the holographic readouts. "The debris will be caught in the gas giant's rings. It creates a temporary high-density interference field. Look at the Terran sensors." On the map, the Terran blockade ships began to flicker. The sudden influx of silicate dust and ice crystals blinded their long-range scanners and disrupted their targeting locks. For a window of exactly 12 minutes, the blockade was blind. "The Gordian knot solution," Elias whispered. "If the path is blocked, change the terrain." During those 12 minutes, Elias moved the civilian transports into the blind spot created by the moon's debris. But instead of fleeing, he moved his cruisers into a suicide orbit around the gas giant, using their reactor cores to boost the interference signal. The simulation ended. The civilians survived. The fleet was lost. But there was a third statistic that flared in gold light: Terran force withdrawal. "They withdrew?" Vaelen asked, stunned. "Why?" "Because," Elias said, leaning against the console, his breath hitching, "I sent a wideband transmission using the interference field as a resonator. I told the Terran commander that I had rigged the moon to explode and that the resulting shockwave would take their entire blockade with it. A bluff. But in the dark, with no sensors, a bluff looks a lot like a death sentence." Vaelen stared at the gold text. "You lied. You used the environment as a weapon of psychological terror. It is messy, unrefined. It saved 10,000 lives, Vaelen, and it saved the fleet mostly. The cruisers had time to eject their escape pods into the civilian transports before the reactors blew." Vaelen looked away from the map, her markings a confused, swirling nebula of violet and gray. She had spent 20 years replaying Heliox in her head, always choosing between two types of death. Elias had chosen a third way, a way that required him to be both a monster and a savior. "The exchange," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What do I have to learn now?" Elias walked around the table, stopping just inches from her. He looked exhausted, the strain of the simulation taking a visible toll on his nervous system. "Today you learn about the empty chair. Another human ritual? On Earth in the ancient times, when a family lost someone at sea or in war, they would keep a chair empty at the dinner table. Not to be sad, but to remind themselves that the person's place was still there. That they were still part of the family's geometry." He reached out, his hand hovering near the heavy armor of her shoulder. "You've been living in an empty room, Vaelen. You've removed the chairs because the sight of them hurts. But a room with no chairs isn't a command center. It's a prison." Vaelen didn't pull away. She looked at his pale, trembling hand. "You think you can just walk onto my ship and redecorate my soul, Elias? You're a diplomat with a martyr complex and a bruise the size of a dinner plate on your ribs. And you're a commander who's afraid that if she stops being a violet death, there will be nothing left but the gray." Valen's bioluminescence flared, a sharp electric shock of color. 0600 tomorrow. The fourth gate, the Void Walk. We go outside the hull. No tethers, just magnetic boots in the silence of the rift. If you can handle the scale of the universe without losing your mind, perhaps I'll believe your empty chair nonsense." She turned to leave, but Elias caught her arm. It was a brief, light touch, but she felt the heat of his skin through her armor. "Why are you so afraid of being human, Vaelen?" She stopped, her back to him. The violet markings on her neck were pulsing with a slow, heavy rhythm. "Because humans die, Elias. They die, and they leave empty chairs. Sitari, we just endure until there is nothing left to break. She walked out, the heavy doors of the tactical suite sealing with a definitive, metallic thud. Elias stood alone in the center of the iron map. The holographic stars were still swirling around him, cold and indifferent. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver locket. Inside was a picture of a woman with a smile that could have outshone a supernova. "Endure," he whispered to the silence. "That's the trick, isn't it?" He coughed, a sharp, wet sound that echoed in the cathedral of glass. When he pulled his hand away from his mouth, it was spotted with flecks of dark crimson blood. The radiation was winning, but he still had 6 gates to go. The airlock of the Ethelgard hissed with the sound of depressurization, a violent metallic sigh that seemed to echo the tension between the 2 figures standing within the staging bay. Outside the reinforced hull, the Onyx Rift waited, a churning, kaleidoscopic abyss of purple radiation and jagged silicate clouds. It was a place where the laws of physics felt more like suggestions, and where the silence was so absolute it could drive a lesser mind to madness. Vaelen Thorne checked the seals on her external combat suit. It was a matte black exoskeleton designed for maximum mobility in zero-gravity environments. Unlike the bulky pressurized suits used by Terran miners, the Sitari rig was sleek, more like a second skin than a vehicle. Her violet markings were visible through the translucent veins of the suit, pulsing with a sharp, staccato rhythm. "The 4th gate, the Void Walk," Vaelen said, her voice crackling through the internal comms. "No tethers, no safety lines. We move across the external spine of the ship, from the hangar to the primary sensor array. 3 kilometers of open space, Elias. If your magnetic boots fail, or if you lose your grip, you'll drift into the rift. We won't come for you. The radiation out there is a real skag. It'll fry your brains before the recovery shuttle can even launch." Elias Vance stood opposite her, adjusting the straps on his Terran-issue EVA suit. It was clunky, white, and bore the scars of a dozen previous repairs. He looked like an antique piece of hardware placed next to a high-performance racing machine. His breathing was heavy, audible through the link, and he seemed to be favoring his left side. "Copy that, Commander," Elias said. He used the slang of the belt haulers, a casual tone that made Valen's jaw tighten. "Just to stroll across the hull. I've done worse in the scrapyards of Mars, though I'll admit, your view is a hell of a lot more intimidating." "This isn't a stroll," Vaelen snapped. "The rift is active today. The graviton surges are hitting the hull every 10 minutes. If you're caught in a pulse while you're detached from the mag rails, you're gone. You're a gearhead, Elias. You know the math. One mistake, and you're just another piece of space debris." She cycled the final door. The world vanished. Stepping out onto the hull of a dreadnought in the middle of a nebula was an exercise in sensory overload. Above them, the Ethelgard was a mountain of dark metal, stretching toward the horizon of the stars. Below there was nothing but the infinite violet swirl of the rift. The silence hit like a physical weight. No vibration, no hum of the ship's engines, just the sound of their own hearts beating inside their helmets. "Move," Vaelen commanded. She engaged her mag boots and began to walk. Sitari hull walking was a fluid, predatory movement, a low-crouched glide that kept at least 2 points of contact with the metal at all times. She moved with a speed that left Elias struggling to keep up. Elias was clumsy. The Terran boots were old, the magnets clunking loudly against the hull, the sound vibrating through his suit. He moved with a stiff, jerky cadence, his hands constantly reaching for the recessed handrails that lined the ship's spine. "You're lagging, envoy," Vaelen said, looking back. She saw him pause, his head hanging low. "Don't tell me the zero-G jitters are finally getting to you. We've only been out here for 5 minutes." "Just catching the rhythm," Elias replied. His voice was strained. "The rift is beautiful, isn't it? My people used to tell stories about places like this. We called them the Empyrean, the places where the gods go to dream." "The gods are dead, Elias, or they're just radiation clusters waiting to cook our DNA," Vaelen said. "On Cetar, we call the rift the throat of the lost, because everything that enters it eventually disappears." She turned to continue, But a sudden alert flared in her HUD. A sharp, high-pitched whine erupted in her ears. "Graviton surge! Red line!" Vaelen shouted. "Elias, mag down! Now!" The hull beneath them groaned. A wave of invisible energy rippled through the Ethel Guard, the massive ship shuddering as if struck by an orbital hammer. Vaelen threw herself flat against the deck, her mag boots and hand clamps locking into the reinforced rail with a violent snap. She looked back. Ilias had been too slow. The surge had hit just as he was stepping over a conduit. The magnetic lock on his right boot failed, and the sheer force of the graviton wave tossed him upward. He was a white speck against the black hull, his arms flailing as he drifted away from the safety of the ship. "Elias!" Valen's voice was a scream. He was drifting. 10 meters. 15. The gap was widening as the rift's natural pull began to exert its influence. "Tether malfunctioned." Elias's voice was surprisingly calm, though it was punctuated by sharp, pained gasps. "The boot magnets are mucked up. I'm starting to drift toward the engine wash." Valen's mind raced. Centauri honor was absolute. A warrior who fell during a trial was a warrior not worth saving. To rescue him would be to admit that the trial was a failure, that her judgment had been flawed. The protocol was simple. Let him drift. But then she saw it. Through the zoom function of her visor, she saw Elias's face. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't panicking. He was looking at the locket he'd pulled from his suit's utility pouch. He was holding it tight, his eyes closed, a look of profound, quiet acceptance on his features. He was waiting for the empty chair. "To hell with the protocol," Vaelen growled. She disengaged her mag boots and fired her suit's emergency thrusters. She was a black bolt of lightning, streaking across the void toward the drifting human. She knew the cost. If she didn't time the intercept perfectly, the momentum would carry them both into the rift. Her suit's fuel was limited. This was a one-way gamble. She collided with him at 40 meters per second, her armored arms wrapping around his torso. The impact was brutal. Vaelen felt a rib crack inside her own chest, but she didn't let go. "Got you, you scag," she grunted. She fired the reverse thrusters, the suit's computer screaming warnings about fuel depletion and structural integrity. They tumbled through the void, a chaotic knot of gray and white, until Vaelen managed to snag a protruding sensor antenna with her left hand clamp. The deceleration was so violent it nearly wrenched her arm from its socket. They swung like a pendulum against the ship's hull, the violet clouds of the rift churning beneath them like a hungry sea. "Vaelen," Elias's voice was a whisper. You came for me." "Shut up," she panted, her markings glowing a desperate flickering purple. "I just didn't want to deal with the paperwork of a dead diplomat. It would have mucked up the whole treaty." She dragged him back to the airlock, her movements slow and mechanical. When the inner door finally cycled and the air rushed back into the bay, Vaelen collapsed against the wall, her helmet hissing as she detached it. Elias was on the floor, his suit's visor cracked. He was coughing again, that same wet, rattling sound. Blood was smeared across his lips and his eyes were unfocused. "You're a fool, Elias Vance," Vaelen said, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and something she couldn't name. "You almost died. For nothing. For a stroll on the hull." Elias looked up at her, a weak, blood-stained smile on his face. "Not for nothing. I saw how you moved. You didn't move like a commander. You moved like a friend." Vaelen froze. The word felt like a brand. "I am not your friend. I am your superior officer for the duration of this pairing. Don't let the lack of oxygen confuse your tiny human brain." She stood up, ignoring the stabbing pain in her side. "The trial is over. You didn't survive because of your skill. You survived because I was weak. Don't expect it to happen again." She walked away, but as she reached the door, she stopped. She looked back at the white, battered suit lying on the deck. Elias was clutching the silver locket again. Vaelen felt a notch in her soul deepen. She had been taught that humans were expendable, that their fragility was a flaw that made them unworthy of respect. But as she watched Elias, dying, broken, yet holding on to his memories as if they were the only thing that mattered, she realized that she had been the one who was blind. She wasn't protecting her warriors by being a cold shield. She was just making sure they died alone. The medical bay of the Ethelgard was a place Vaelen Thorne usually avoided. To her, it was a room of failures, a place where the body admitted defeat. But today, she stood outside the primary recovery tank, her arms crossed, watching the green bioluminescent fluid swirl around the submerged form of Elias Vance. "He shouldn't be alive," Dr. Crick said, tapping a claw against a data slate. The doctor was a tall Centauri with a clinical, detached manner. The graviton surge caused internal hemorrhaging, yes, but that's the least of his problems. "Commander, did you know about his cellular condition?" Vaelen didn't turn her head. He mentioned a bruise, radiation from a colony evacuation. "It's more than a bruise," Crick said, his voice dropping. "It's stage 4 marrow decay. The radiation he inhaled at Solstice didn't just burn his lungs. It's rewriting his genetic code into a script for suicide. His cells are failing to replicate. Every time he exerts himself, every time he walks in that gravity well, or fights in the arena, he is literally tearing himself apart." Vaelen felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. "How long?" "In Terran years. 6 months. Maybe 8, if he stays in a stasis cot. But the way he's been training, he'll be lucky to see the next moon cycle." Crix looked at the tank. Why would a man in his condition volunteer for a deep space military assignment? It's illogical. "He said he wanted to build a bridge," Vaelen whispered. "Well, he's building it with his own bones," the doctor replied. "I've stabilized him for now, but he needs rest. Real rest. If you put him through another gate, you might as well just shove him out the airlock yourself." Vaelen walked away without a word. She headed toward her private quarters, but her feet led her instead to the tactical suite. She sat in the darkness, the iron map silent and cold. She thought about the humanistic theme Elias kept pushing, the idea that prejudice was a mask for fear. She had judged him as weak because his skin was soft. She had judged him as a coward because he used diplomacy instead of a blade. But Elias Vance was fighting a war every single second, a war against his own body, and he was doing it without complaint, without seeking pity, and with a goal that transcended his own survival. He was braver than any Centauri she had ever commanded. A chime at the door broke her reverie. It was Lieutenant Drex. "Commander, we have a situation," Drex said, his markings flashing a worried yellow. A scout ship from the Synaptic Union was spotted on the edge of the rift. "They're not just raiding. They're setting up a long-range dampener. They're planning to trap the Ethelgard here." Vaelen stood up, her commander's instincts flaring. "Standard intercept? Send the fighter squadrons." "We can't," Drex said. "The dampener is using the rift's own frequency. Our sensors are blind. If we send the fighters out, they'll lose their navigation lock and drift. We need a way to triangulate the dampener's position without relying on traditional Centauri scans." Vaelen looked at the iron map. She remembered Elias's solution at Heliox. Change the terrain. Use the environment. "Bring me Elias Vance," she said. "Commander, the doctor said—" "I don't care what the doctor said. Wake him up. Get him a stim shot. I need a different edge, and I need it now." 20 minutes later, Elias was wheeled into the suite. He looked like a ghost, his skin a sickly, translucent white, his amber eyes sunken and tired. He was wrapped in a thermal blanket, but his hands were steady. "Vaelen," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "You missed the music? Or is there another gate I need to walk through?" "The 5th gate is closed, Elias," Vaelen said, her voice surprisingly soft. She walked to him and knelt beside his chair. "I'm not testing you anymore. I'm asking for your help." She explained the situation with the Synaptic Union. She showed him the sensor ghosts in the dampener signal. "My officers are stuck in the manual. They want to fight a war that isn't there. You see patterns where we see chaos. How do we find that ship?" Elias studied the map for a long time. His fingers hovered over the controls, trembling slightly, but his gaze was focused. "The Centauri scanners look for mass and energy signatures," Elias said. "The Union knows that. That's why they're hiding in the rift's frequency. But the rift isn't just energy, it's matter. Silicate dust, ionized gas." He looked at Vaelen. "How do your people feel about the Echo?" "The Echo? It's a legend. Old navigators say the rift remembers the ships that pass through it." "It's not a legend, Vaelen. It's physics. A ship of that size creates a displacement wake in the dust, like a boat on water. You don't look for the ship. You look for the place where the dust isn't. Vaelen stared at him. It was so simple, yet so counterintuitive to Sitari military doctrine. They were trained to hunt the light, not the shadow. Drex, Vaelen barked into the comms, recalibrate the primary array to the sub-micron dust frequency. Look for a void in the violet. Find the place where the rift is quiet. Commander, that will take 40 minutes to... Do it in 20, or I'll have your markings for a trophy. She turned back to Elias. He was leaning back, his eyes closed, his breathing labored. You did it again, she said. You found the third way. The world isn't binary, Vaelen, Elias whispered. It's not just strong and weak. It's not just Sitari and human. There's so much in the middle. The gray, remember? Vaelen reached out and took his hand. It was cold, so much smaller than hers, but it felt like the strongest thing in the room. I remember. She felt a sudden surge of shame. She had spent weeks trying to break this man, trying to prove her superiority, while he had been quietly showing her how to be a better leader. She had judged the Terran alliance as a collection of soft diplomats. But if they were all like Elias, the Sitari had been lucky to survive the war at all. Elias, she said, her voice thick with emotion, why didn't you tell me? About the marrow decay? He opened one eye. Because then, you would have treated me like a patient, not like a partner. I didn't come here to be cared for, Vaelen. I came here to be known. The comms crackled. It was Drex. Commander, we have a lock. The Union ship is hiding in the shadow of the fourth ice moon. They're exposed. The squadrons are launching now. Finish them, Vaelen said, her eyes never leaving Elias. No survivors. She turned off the comms, plunging the room into a soft, violet silence. You passed the fifth gate, Elias, she said. The gate of the mind. Do I get my exchange? Yes, Vaelen said. She stood up and walked to the wall locker. She pulled out an old weathered wooden box, the only possession she had kept from the Thorne Guard. Inside was a small ceremonial cup carved from the bone of a Sitari suncat. She poured a small amount of clear, shimmering liquid into it, Sitari fire wine. In my culture, she said, sitting back down beside him, we share this when we become brothers in arms. It means that your ghosts are my ghosts. Your empty chairs are mine to guard. She took a sip and then offered the cup to him. Elias took it, his hands shaking, but he managed to drink. He coughed, the fire of the wine bringing a flash of color back to his cheeks. That has a kick, he wheezed. It's meant to remind you that you're alive, Vaelen said. She looked at him, and for the first time in 20 years, she didn't see a human, a diplomat, or an anchor. She saw a partner. She saw a bridge. I was wrong about you, Elias. I was wrong about all of it. Prejudice is a heavy suit of armor, Vaelen, Elias said, his voice fading as the stims began to wear off. It protects you, but it makes it impossible to touch anyone. He drifted off into a deep, exhausted sleep, his hand still resting in hers. Vaelen Thorne, commander of the Ethel Guard, Loyjal Sham of the Sitari Empire, sat in the dark and cried. She didn't cry for the war, or for the Thorne Guard, or for her shame. She cried for the man who was teaching her how to live, just as he was running out of time to do it himself. The turning point had passed. The predator had found her heart, and it was a fragile, human thing. The Ethel Guard was no longer a sanctuary of cold logic. It had become a labyrinth of red emergency lights and the rhythmic, bone-deep thrum of a ship screaming in pain. The internal sabotage had been surgical. While the fighter squadrons were busy hunting the synaptic Union scout ships in the dust wakes of the rift, a radical faction of the Sitari High Command, the Obsidian Fang, had made their move. They didn't use plasma cannons or graviton beams. They used a logic virus, a jagged piece of code that had turned the ship's own automated security turrets against its crew. Commander Vaelen Thorne stood in the darkened corridor of Deck 9, her back against a vibrating bulkhead. Her indigo markings were a frantic, jagged mess of light, reflecting the adrenaline coursing through her slate-gray veins. In her right hand, she gripped a heavy-duty pulse carbine. With her left arm, she supported Elias Vance. Elias was a wreck. The medical stims had worn off hours ago, and the marrow decay was taking its pound of flesh. His breath came in wet, hitching rattles, and his skin had transitioned from a pale white to a terrifying, translucent gray. Every few steps, his knees would buckle, and Vaelen would have to catch him, the weight of his human frame feeling both impossibly light and heavy with the burden of his impending death. "Vaelen," Elias wheezed, his head lolling against her shoulder. You need to leave me. This is a total goat rope. Gorst isn't playing around. He's already locked down the bridge." "Shut your mouth, Elias," Vaelen growled, her four eyes scanning the junction ahead. "Admiral Gorst is a fossil. He thinks he can turn back the clock to the days of the Great Purge. He thinks killing you and framing me will restore the Empire's honor. He's a scag who doesn't realize the world has moved on. He's got 80% of the security detail," Elias reminded her, a violent cough racking his chest. He wiped a smear of blood from his chin with a trembling hand. "The math, it's not in our favor. You're a tactical genius. You know the score. Leave the primate, save the commander." Vaelen stopped. She turned him around, her clawed hands gripping his shoulders with a force that was almost painful. Her violet markings flared with a brilliant, blinding intensity, illuminating the dark corridor like a star. "Listen to me, you stubborn human," she hissed. "For 30 years I lived by the math. I lived by the protocols that said the weak are fodder and the strong are the only ones who matter. I lived in a world of slate and violet, and I was dying of thirst in it. You walked onto my ship and showed me the gray. You showed me that a dying man can have more spine than a legion of elite guards. I am not leaving you. Not because of the treaty, not because of the brass, but because you are the only one who had the balls to tell me I was lonely." Elias looked up at her, his amber eyes clouded with pain, but sparked by a faint, defiant warmth. "Well, when you put it like that, I guess I'm stuck with you." "Damn right," Vaelen said. A high-pitched whine echoed from the ceiling. A concealed security turret swiveled into place. Vaelen didn't think. She reacted. She shoved Elias into an alcove and rolled across the deck, firing a 3-round burst from her pulse carbine. The turret exploded in a shower of sparks and molten plastic. "Contact front!" a voice barked from the shadows. 3 Centauri guards, clad in the black and crimson armor of the Obsidian Fang, rounded the corner. They didn't hesitate. They saw their legendary commander and opened fire. Vaelen ducked behind a structural pillar, the plasma bolt sizzling against the metal inches from her head. "Commander Thorne!" "Sakilikate," one of the guards shouted. "Lay down your weapon. Admiral Gorst has declared you a traitor to the Blood Onyx. You have been tainted by the primates. Surrender and your death will be swift." Vaelen glanced at Elias. He was slumped against the wall, his eyes fluttering. He was slipping away, his body finally surrendering to the radiation that had been eating him for years. If she surrendered, they might give him medical care, or they might just execute him on the spot. If she fought, they were both dead anyway. It was the Weaver's choice. But this time, there was no holographic simulation. "You want my weapon?" Vaelen roared, her voice echoing through the deck like a thunderclap. "Come and take it, you gutless pups! You talk of honor, but you hide behind viruses and shadows. I am Vaelen Thorne. I have seen the rift breathe, and I have seen a human stand where you would crawl. If I am a traitor, then let the stars judge me." She leaped from behind the pillar, her carbine singing a song of violet fire. She moved with a ferocity that stunned the guards. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for the lesson she had learned. She was fighting for the empty chair. She took a glancing blow to her left shoulder, the armor melting away, exposing the gray muscle beneath, but she didn't slow down. She closed the distance in 4 strides, swinging the butt of her carbine like a mace. She crushed the helmet of the lead guard and used his falling body as a shield against the others. By the time the last guard lay still on the deck, Vaelen was panting, her markings flickering with exhaustion. She stumbled back to Elias, her blood dripping onto the mats. "Elias," she whispered, pulling him upright. "Elias, stay with me. We're almost to the reactor core. We can bypass Gorst's lockout from there." Elias opened his eyes. They were unfocused, the amber turning to a dull gold. "Vaelen, the core. It's a suicide run. The radiation, it'll be 1,000 times the Terran limit. My marrow, it'll turn to ash. I know, Vaelen said, her voice thick, but the core has its own manual override. If we can get inside, we can purge the virus and signal the loyalist factions in the fleet. It's the only way to save the ship. You can't survive that much radiation either, Elias said. Even Satari skin has its limits. Then we go together, Vaelen said. She looked at the door to the reactor chamber. It was a massive lead-lined slab of metal. We changed the terrain, Elias. Remember? We don't look for the light. We look for the shadow. She dragged him toward the door. She knew what was waiting for them on the other side. The reactor core of the Ethel Guard was a sun in a bottle, a churning vortex of graviton energy and lethal isotopes. To enter was to accept a death sentence. But as Vaelen looked at Elias, she realized that she was no longer afraid of the empty chair. She was only afraid of a room where no one had ever sat at all. The air inside the reactor antechamber was heavy, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that felt like it was trying to shake Vaelen's teeth out of her skull. The temperature had climbed to 40 degrees Celsius, and the smell of ozone was thick enough to coat the back of her throat. Elias was barely conscious now. Vaelen had strapped him into a spare environmental rig she'd scavenged from a nearby locker, but it was a flimsy defense against the raw power of the dreadnought's heart. The door to the core hissed open. Inside the reactor was a pillar of blinding, white-violet light, contained within a series of rotating magnetic rings. It was beautiful and terrifying, the ultimate expression of Satari power. "Commander Thorne," a cold, amplified voice boomed. Vaelen shielded her eyes. Standing on the elevated control platform was Admiral Gorst. He was an old Satari, his gray skin hanging in deep folds, his markings a dull, stagnant crimson. Behind him stood two elite guards, their rifles aimed directly at Vaelen's head. "Look at you," Gorst said, his voice dripping with contempt. "The great commander, reduced to a pack mule for a dying primate. You have fallen so far, Vaelen. You were supposed to be the future of the Empire, the sword that would finally excise the human cancer from the galaxy." Vaelen stepped onto the catwalk, her boots echoing on the metal. She didn't put Elias down. She held him close, his head resting against the crook of her neck. "The only cancer I see is you, Gorst," Vaelen said. "You're a man who's so afraid of the dark that he'd rather burn the whole house down than light a candle. You think the humans are weak because they feel? You think their empathy is a flaw?" She looked down at Elias, then back at the Admiral. "This man has been dying since the day he stepped aboard," she said. "Every step he took in my trials was a victory over a pain you couldn't even imagine. He didn't come here to conquer us. He came here to save us from ourselves. And what did we do? We tried to break him. We tried to prove he was nothing, because his skin wasn't as thick as ours." "He is nothing," Gorst roared. "He is a biological error, a temporary fluke in a universe that belongs to the strong. Kill the human, Vaelen. Drop him into the reactor wash, and I will reinstate you. I will tell the High Command that you were under a human mind lock. You can have your fleet back. You can have your honor back." Vaelen looked at the reactor wash, a pool of superheated plasma swirling beneath the catwalk. One shove, and Elias would be vaporized. The math was simple. One human life for a career, a ship, and a world of power. She looked at Elias. He had managed to open his eyes. He wasn't looking at the reactor. He was looking at her. "Do it, Vaelen," Elias whispered. The link was weak, his voice barely a ghost in her ear. "The ship. Save the ship. I'm an empty chair. Either way." Vaelen felt a surge of grief so sharp it felt like a physical blade in her chest. She remembered the cello music. She remembered the dust wake. She remembered the hand she'd held in the darkness. "No," Vaelen said. She turned back to Gorst, her violet markings erupting into a flare of light that rivaled the reactor core itself. "I choose the third way," she said. In one fluid motion, Vaelen didn't fire her carbine at Gorst. She fired it at the magnetic containment rings. The primary ring buckled. The white-violet light of the reactor surged, the magnetic field destabilizing. The entire ship groaned, the gravity failing for a split second as the reactor began to vent its energy into the room. "You're mad," Gorst screamed, his guards losing their footing in the fluctuating gravity. "You'll kill us all." "Not all of us," Vaelen said. She leaped, not toward Gorst, but toward the manual override terminal located on the far side of the reactor core. She used the shifting gravity to propel herself across the gap, her body a gray streak of light through the ionizing radiation. She hit the terminal hard, her clawed fingers flying over the physical switches. This was the one place Gorst virus couldn't reach, the hardwired mechanical failsafes. Purge the virus, reset the security grid, signal the loyalists. The radiation alarms were screaming. Vaelen could feel her own skin beginning to blister, the intense energy of the reactor beginning to unravel her Satari resilience. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. "Elias," she shouted, "hold on! Just 10 more seconds!" The reactor flared one last time, a wave of heat and light that washed over the platform. Gorst and his guards were thrown back, their armor failing under the thermal stress. Vaelen slammed the final lever. The Ethel Guard hummed. The red lights vanished, replaced by the steady calm blue of the secondary power grid. The automated turrets in the corridors powered down. The internal comms crackled to life. "This is Commander Vaelen Thorne," she broadcasted on all frequencies. "The mutiny is suppressed. All loyal personnel, secure the bridge and detention levels. Admiral Gorst is relieved of command." She collapsed against the terminal, her breathing shallow and ragged. The radiation had done its work. She could feel a deep, hollow ache in her bones, a fatigue that went beyond anything she'd ever felt in combat. She looked across the chamber. Elias was still on the catwalk, his environmental suit scorched and smoking. He wasn't moving. "Elias!" Vaelen crawled toward him. Her legs felt like they were made of sand, her vision tunneling into a pinpoint of violet light. She reached him, her shaking hand touching his visor. "Elias, wake up. I did it. The ship is safe. The treaty holds." Elias didn't answer. His amber eyes were open, staring up at the shifting violet clouds of the rift, visible through the reactor's emergency vents. There was a peacefulness in his expression that Vaelen had never seen before. She pulled him into her lap, her gray tears falling onto his cracked visor. She didn't care about the radiation. She didn't care about the Empire. She didn't care about the math. She just held him. "You didn't fail, Elias," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You built the bridge. You built it right through the middle of my heart. Transformation is a painful thing. It requires the old self to be burned away, to be sacrificed on the altar of a new understanding." As the Loyalist security teams burst into the reactor chamber, they found their legendary commander, the Loi Jiao Sham, the Violet Death, sitting in the radioactive wash, holding a human as if he were the most precious thing in the universe. She was no longer a shield of cold stone. She was a woman, scarred and broken, who had finally learned that the most important trial wasn't about who stayed standing. It was about who you were willing to fall with. The theme had moved from subtext to the heart of the action. Prejudice had been the virus, and Elias Vance had been the cure. Vaelen Thorne looked at the stars, her violet markings glowing with a soft, mournful light. She had a lot of empty chairs to fill, but for the first time in 20 years, she wasn't afraid to start setting the table. The silence that followed the suppression of the mutiny was not the peaceful quiet of a graveyard, but the heavy, pressurized stillness of a ship holding its breath. The Ethel Guard drifted on the edge of the Onyx Rift, its secondary power systems humming with a low, mournful frequency that vibrated through the soles of Vaelen Thorne's boots. The primary lights had been restored to a steady, dim blue, casting long shadows across the command deck. Shadows that no longer felt like hiding places for assassins, but like the tired exhalations of a giant that had survived a fever. Commander Vaelen Thorne sat in her high-backed chair, but she did not sit with the rigid, sovereign posture of the Violet Death. Her slate-gray skin was mapped with medical patches, covering the weeping blisters where the reactor's radiation had kissed her flesh. Her indigo markings were dim, pulsing with a slow, exhausted rhythm that mimicked a dying ember. Across from her, Admiral Gorst and his inner circle were being led away in magnetic restraints. Gorst stopped as he passed her chair. His face was a mask of scorched skin and stagnant crimson markings. He looked at Vaelen, then at the empty command station where Elias Vance should have been sitting as the diplomatic observer. You've won a hollow victory, Thorne, Gorst rasped, his voice a dry rattle of contempt. You saved the primates, but you've poisoned the well of our heritage. You chose a dying creature of silk and bone over the steel of your own blood. The High Command will hear of this third way of yours, and they will see it for what it is, a notched blade. You are no longer fit to lead the Centauri. Vaelen didn't rise to his bait. She didn't even look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the silver locket resting in her palm, the one she had retrieved from Elias's cold fingers in the reactor wash. The well was already poisoned, Gorst, Vaelen said quietly, her voice devoid of its usual predatory edge. It was poisoned by the belief that strength is the absence of feeling. You think you're a guardian of our honor? You're just a scavenger picking at the scabs of a 30-year-old war. The world Elias showed me, it has more colors than slate and violet. If that makes me unfit in your eyes, then I'll wear that notch as a badge of rank. Take him to the detention block, Lieutenant Drex commanded, stepping forward. Drex's own markings were a subdued lavender. He looked at Vaelen with a mixture of concern and a newfound, tentative respect. And make sure the isolation field is at maximum. I don't want his ghost mucking up my ship's comms. As the heavy doors hissed shut behind the mutineers, the bridge returned to its hum. Secondary officers moved with a cautious, hushed efficiency. The air was still thick with the smell of scorched plastic and ozone, but the frantic energy of the battle had bled away. Commander, Drex said, standing at a respectful distance, the human delegation from the Unity transport is requesting a status update. They detected the reactor flare. They want to know about Envoy Vance. Vaelen closed her hand over the locket. The metal was cold, yet she felt a phantom warmth emanating from it, a memory of the heat Elias had carried despite his failing marrow. Tell them the envoy is concluded, Vaelen said, the word catching in her throat like a shard of ice. Tell them his mission was a total success. He built the bridge. Ma'am, Drex hesitated, his four eyes shifting. The crew, they're asking about the 9th gate, the final trial. Since he didn't make it to the end of the moon cycle, some of the grunts are saying the convergence treaty is technically mucked up. Vaelen stood up, her joints popping with a sound like dry wood. The pain in her ribs was a constant, sharp reminder of the reactor wash, but it was a grounding sensation. It reminded her that she was still here. The 9th gate isn't a physical location, Drex, she said, looking at the bridge crew. Elias walked through it the moment he stood between me and the reactor. He showed us that the ultimate trial isn't about surviving the void. It's about who you're willing to see in the dark. Tell the crew that the trials are over. From now on, the Ethelgard will operate under a new standing order. Which is? We stop being a shield of stone, Vaelen said. We start being a place where chairs are set for those who aren't there yet. Drex didn't scoff. He simply nodded, his markings pulsing a steady, thoughtful indigo. Copy that, Commander. I'll relay the word to the mess halls. And not, ma'am? I think I'll keep that cello music on the ship's internal loop for a while. It's a real scag for the nerves, but it helps the night cycle go by. Vaelen watched him walk back to his station. She realized that the transformation was not hers alone. The Ethelgard was a massive, ancient thing, built for war and defined by the scars it inflicted. But Elias had planted a seed in its metallic heart. It would take time, months, perhaps years to grow, but the atmosphere had already shifted. The soldiers weren't talking about primates or shatterglass anymore. They were talking about the human who had cracked the sun to save a commander who had spent weeks trying to break him. She walked to the medical bay, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She found Dr. Crix standing over a shrouded cot in the corner of the room. The doctor looked older in the dim blue light, his slate-gray skin sagging with fatigue. I did what I could, Commander, Crix said, not looking up. But the math was always against him. The radiation was just the final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. He was already a ghost when he walked through the airlock on day one. He was the most alive thing on this ship, Crix, Vaelen said, standing beside the cot. She reached out and pulled back the shroud just enough to see Elias's face. He looked peaceful. The grayness of his skin didn't look like defeat anymore. It looked like the quiet rest of a sculptor who had finished his masterpiece. She remembered him in the combat arena, dancing through her strikes, using her own power to keep her at bay. She remembered him in the gravity well, refusing to yield to the threefold weight of her prejudice. "He told me that prejudice was a suit of armor," Vaelen whispered. "He said it makes it impossible to touch anyone." "He wasn't wrong," Crix replied, his voice a clinical rasp. "Humans are fragile, yes. Their cells are weak, their lifespans are a blink of an eye to a Centauri. But they have this terrifying ability to project their internal world onto the universe. They don't just endure the void, they try to make it feel like home. It's a tactical disadvantage in a skirmish, perhaps. But in the long run, it's how civilizations survive." Vaelen reached into her pocket and pulled out the small bone-carved cup she had shared with Elias in the tactical suite. It was empty now, but the scent of fire wine lingered. "He taught me that the empty chair isn't about loss," Vaelen said. "It's about making sure there's room for a different edge. Crix, I want his effects sent to his family on the Solstice colony. Every locket, every music file, and I want a full Centauri honor guard to accompany the transport." "That's a high-level diplomatic gesture, ma'am. The High Command can suck space dust," Vaelen snapped, a flicker of her old fire returning to her indigo eyes. "I am the commander of the Ethel Guard. If I say a human earned a Centauri funeral, then the stars will move to make it happen. Is that clear?" Crix allowed a thin, dry smile to touch his lips. "Perfectly clear, Commander. I'll make the arrangements." Vaelen stayed with the cot for an hour. She didn't say a prayer. Centauri didn't have gods to talk to, but she spoke to the silence. She told Elias about the bridge, about Drex's lavender markings, and about the way the rift looked now that she wasn't trying to conquer it. She felt a profound sense of processing, a mental unspooling of 40 years of military doctrine. She had been a hammer for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to be the metal. As she left the medical bay, she didn't head for her quarters. She went to the ship's primary mess hall. It was nearly empty, the night shift workers eating in silence. She walked to the center of the room and chose a table. She sat down and, for the first time in her career, she didn't sit in the center. She sat to the side. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement of her blistered gray hand, she pulled out a second chair. She pushed it into the table, leaving it empty, but positioned perfectly as if waiting for a guest. One by one, the other soldiers in the room looked up. They saw the Loy Jiao Sham, their fearsome commander, sitting with an empty chair. They didn't laugh. They didn't whisper. One young Centauri private, a recruit who had barely seen 20 years, stood up from his own table. He walked over, paused, and then pulled out an empty chair at his own table before returning to his meal. A silent wave of movement rippled through the mess hall. Chairs were pulled out. Tables were rearranged. The geometry of the room shifted from a series of isolated circles into a network of potential connections. Vaelen Thorne closed her eyes and listened. She didn't hear the hum of the ship or the sound of the rift. She heard the sound of 10,000 empty chairs finally being acknowledged. It was a beautiful, haunting music, and for the first time in her life, she understood exactly how to sing along. The Onyx Rift was a kaleidoscope of violet and gold as the Ethel Guard reached the primary jump point. It had been exactly 4 months since the mutiny had been suppressed, and 3 months since the official burial of Elias Vance. The dreadnought was no longer the scarred, ozone-scented wreck it had been. The repairs were complete, but the ship wore its patches with pride. The new hull plating wasn't a perfect match for the old slate gray, creating a dappled, variegated appearance that the crew had nicknamed the human camouflage. Commander Vaelen Thorne stood on the viewing deck, watching the Terran diplomatic vessel, the Pax Nova, slide alongside them. Today was the official renewal of the Convergence Treaty, not a ceremonial seal of war-weary grunts, but a genuine exchange of tactical and cultural data. Vaelen was no longer the impenetrable fortress of indigo light. Her radiation blisters had healed into silver-white scars that laced across her arms and jawline, permanent records of the Third Way. She wore her command regalia, but she had left the heavy shoulder guards in her locker. She felt lighter, more agile, and her markings were a steady, warm lavender that pulsed with a calm, inviting rhythm. "Commander Thorne," Lieutenant Drex said, approaching her with a data slate. "The human envoy is ready to beam aboard. His name is Julian Vance. Elias's younger brother. He's a bit greener than the last one, ma'am. He looks like he's about to jump out of his skin. Vaelen turned, her four eyes softening. Is he? Then we'll have to make sure he finds his footing. Tell the docking bay to lower the gravity to 1.5 standard. I don't want his first step on my ship to feel like a trial. Drex smiled, his markings a bright indigo. Copy that. 1.5 it is? And I've already set up the greeting room. I put 2 chairs out, just like you ordered. Good work, Drex. Vaelen walked toward the docking bay, her gait fluid and confident. As she passed through the corridors, she saw the transformation in her crew. A human technician was working side by side with a Centauri engineer on a sensor array, their voices a mix of sharp Centauri clicks and casual human slang. Hey, don't muck that up, Crix. The human laughed, wiping grease from his forehead. If that graviton cell blows, we're both space toast. Your math is unrefined, Steve, the Centauri replied, though his markings were a playful yellow. But your scrapping technique has its merits. Pass me the wrench. Vaelen felt a surge of warmth. This was the bridge Elias had envisioned. It wasn't perfect. There were still flashes of prejudice, still moments of friction, but they were no longer fighting to prove who was superior. They were fighting to prove that they were better together. She reached the docking bay as the airlock hissed open. Julian Vance stepped out, looking exactly like a younger version of Elias, the same earth-colored hair, the same amber eyes, but with a frantic, nervous energy that Elias had long since burned away. He looked at Vaelen, and for a second he froze, his eyes widening at the sight of the 7-foot Centauri commander. Vaelen didn't stand over him. She didn't use her height to intimidate. She stepped forward and extended her hand, not in a Centauri salute, but in a firm, human handshake. Welcome aboard the Ethelgard, Envoy Julian, she said, her voice a warm rasp. I knew your brother. He was the bravest man I ever met. He taught me that even the sharpest blade is useless if it has no heart. Julian took her hand, his own trembling slightly. He wrote about you, Commander, in his final logs. He said you were the only one who truly understood what he was trying to do. Thank you for bringing him home. It was the only scrap worth fighting, Vaelen said, using Elias's slang with a nostalgic smile. Come, we have a lot of work to do, and I believe I owe your family a lecture on the tactical advantages of the empty chair. As they walked through the ship, Vaelen felt the weight of her journey. She looked at the silver scars on her hands and remembered the 9 gates. She had started as a predator seeking to break a diplomat, and she had ended as a leader seeking to heal a galaxy. The humanistic theme, the idea that our differences are not walls but windows, was no longer a subtext. It was the very air she breathed. She led Julian to the mess hall, which was now filled with tables set with extra chairs. She sat down, and Julian sat across from her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. 2 species, 2 histories, 1 future. I remember the day the Ethelgard felt like a tomb. I remember standing before the viewport and seeing only targets, calculating the math of an endless, slate and violet war. I thought I was strong because I was impenetrable, because I had built a fortress around my markings to keep the ghosts of the Thorngard at bay. I viewed humanity as a biological error, a fragile species of primates who used words to mask their fear of the void. I was a commander of steel, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Then came Elias. He didn't bring a fleet. He brought a cello solo and a silver locket. He showed me that true strength isn't the ability to endure weight, but the courage to acknowledge its existence. He walked through my gates and showed me that my armor was actually a prison. He taught me that being human, even for a Centauri, means understanding that a notched blade can still cut, and that an empty chair isn't a sign of failure, but a promise of a place. I've learned that the void isn't something to be conquered. It's something to be shared. We are all drifting in the rift, clutching our memories and hoping for a hand in the dark. Elias gave me his hand, and in doing so, he gave me back my soul. I am no longer the Loi Jiao Sham. I am a woman who knows that the most important command is to sit down and listen. The stars are still cold and the math is still hard, but as long as we keep the chairs ready, the night will never be silent again. I spent a lifetime building walls out of slate gray stone and indigo light, thinking they were the only things keeping me safe from the ghosts of my past. It took a dying man with a different edge to show me that those walls were actually preventing me from seeing the beauty of the gray. I wonder, as you navigate your own universe, what armor have you been wearing so long that you've forgotten it's a prison? What empty chair have you been afraid to set at your table, fearing the pain of who might not sit there? Vaelen Thorne looked at the young man across from her, and for the first time in 30 years, she didn't see an envoy. She saw a friend. She reached out and placed the silver locket on the table between them, the metal catching the soft, violet light of the rift. "Let's start the exchange," she said, her lavender markings glowing with a steady, peaceful warmth. "Tell me about the mountains of Earth. I've heard they have a different kind of silence." The Ethelgard jumped into warp, leaving a wake of shimmering dust that lingered in the void like a promise kept.